Nobody expected Mangonio to say no. Not when the offer on the table was $50 million US, enough to buy a mansion in Malibu, retire to the tropics, and never lift another shovel again. In the heart of Silicon Valley, where land was being swallowed by glass towers and high-end condos, 10 untouched acres of soil seemed like a glitch in the system. And Mangonio, the 67-year-old Filipino farmer who had worked that land with his bare hands for over 4 decades, was the last one holding out. Real estate developers called it a golden opportunity. Local officials said it was inevitable progress. But when they sat across from Mangonio in his small, weathered farmhouse and slid that signed check across the table, his answer stunned everyone. "This land," he said without raising his voice, "feeds people. It's not for sale, not even for $50 million. The silence that followed was louder than traffic. And just like that, the battle began. Mangonio was not born into wealth. He was born in the rice fields of Nueva Ecija, Philippines, the eldest of 7, taught to till soil before he could read. When he immigrated to the United States in 1982, he arrived with 2 things, a duffel bag and a deep respect for the land. He started as a janitor, worked overnight shifts at a food packing plant, then cleaned offices during the day. But every dollar he earned, he saved. His dream wasn't to own a sports car or a luxury apartment. It was to plant. When he finally saved enough to buy 10 acres on the outskirts of a then-sleepy California town, people laughed. "It's dry," they said. "Too small." But Mangonio didn't care. He planted eggplants, tomatoes, ampalaya, and lettuce. He grew calamansi and sold it at farmers' markets. He worked under the sun without complaint, always smiling. He called the farm Lupang Mahalaga, the precious land. And for him, it was. Over the years, the town changed. Where there were once open fields, there were now coffee chains, luxury gyms, and software company HQs. Developers gobbled up land like it was candy, turning farms into parking lots and orchards into gated communities. But through all the noise, Mangonio's farm remained untouched, like a green island in a sea of glass and steel. Locals still came for his vegetables. Children would wave at him as he watered his plants with the same rusty hose he'd used since the 90s. Even tech workers started showing up, buying organic produce and asking about his farming techniques. "What fertilizer do you use?" they'd ask. He'd grin. "Patience," he'd reply. But beneath the humble smiles and gentle eyes, Mangonio saw what was coming. He knew they would come for the land eventually. What he didn't know was just how much pressure they would apply, and how loud the world would get once he resisted. The first offer came quietly. A real estate executive showed up in a shiny black SUV and made casual conversation about modernizing the area. He offered $2 million. Mangonio politely declined. The second offer came a year later, $10 million, with a promise to name a nearby street after him. "Tony away," the man joked. Again, he declined. Then came the media pressure. Local newspapers ran editorials about wasted land and economic bottlenecks. Social media users criticized the farmer for blocking progress. They said he was selfish, outdated, a relic. But Mangonio didn't flinch. "If land is only valuable when it's sold," he said to a reporter once, "then we've forgotten why it matters." The story began gaining attention. Environmentalists supported him. Urban developers rolled their eyes. Comment sections exploded with arguments. But Mangonio just kept farming, watering, planting, teaching. His hands stayed in the soil, even as the world around him tried to dig him out. When the $50 million offer landed on his doorstep, it wasn't just a contract. It was pressure disguised as opportunity. This time, it wasn't just one developer. It was a coalition of investors, politicians, and legal advisors. They sent architects with 3D renderings, showing a future of shopping centers, cafes, and high-rise condos standing where his crops grew. They offered him a penthouse in exchange for his farmhouse. They said his farm was sentimentally valuable, but logistically impractical. They promised him a legacy. They were sure he'd fold. But Mangonio looked them in the eyes and said, "When I came to this country, I did not come to erase who I am. I came to grow." The room fell silent. Not out of respect, but disbelief. One of the developers muttered under his breath, "This is the most expensive farmer in California." What they didn't realize was they weren't negotiating with a businessman. They were facing a man rooted in something deeper. After Mangonio's rejection, the city gave its final approval to begin building around his property. The developers weren't interested in a legal fight. They would simply go around him. And so construction began. Cranes moved in. Concrete was poured. Luxury townhouses began to rise. In less than a year, what was once open space became a forest of high-end real estate, except for one plot. In the middle of it all, Mangonio's farm stood untouched, like a scar on the face of modernity, or a badge of resistance. Drone footage started circulating online. People were amazed. Some laughed. "Looks like the farm from up," one tweet said. Others called it the last honest land in California. News outlets picked up the story, and as developers tried to ignore it, the world leaned in. Who was this Filipino man who said no to 50 million? What did he know that the rest of us had forgotten? As the story spread, people started showing up. College students, gardeners, journalists, families. They came to meet the man behind the farm. Some just stood at the edge of the fence, looking in. Others knocked on his door, asking to volunteer. Mangonio was surprised, but he didn't turn anyone away. He welcomed them with jackfruit juice and homemade pancit. He taught kids how to plant camote. He told stories about his childhood in the Philippines, where farming wasn't a lifestyle, it was survival. "You learn what matters when you grow food with your hands," he'd say. And slowly, the farm became more than a patch of green. It became a classroom, a sanctuary, a symbol. Mangonio didn't post online. He didn't do interviews unless they brought lunch. But still, the world couldn't stop watching. Because in a time of instant everything, one man's refusal to sell out was the most radical act anyone had seen. Developers were furious. Their marketing campaigns were being overshadowed by drone videos of tomatoes. They complained to the city. They offered Mangonio a secret deal, keep the farm, but sell the story rights. He refused. Then came the lawsuits. Claims of zoning violations, environmental impact, and noise complaints. None of them stuck. The community had rallied behind him. Petitioners gathered signatures. Local lawyers volunteered their time. Even celebrities began commenting online, calling him a hero. A famous chef offered to buy produce exclusively from his farm. A children's book was written about the farmer who said no. Through it all, Mangonio remained humble. "I don't need to fight," he told one news crew. "The land fights for itself. Just look." He pointed to a row of fresh okra glistening in the sun. "What else do I need?" And in that simplicity, people found something profound. A reminder that value isn't always measured in millions. The biggest surprise came 6 months later. On a bright Saturday morning, Mangonio opened his gates to the public and announced the creation of the Lupang Mahalaga Community Farm. There were no press releases, no sponsors, just hand-painted signs and word of mouth. He offered free vegetables to low-income families. No forms, no IDs, just take what you need. He started weekend farming lessons for kids, using simple tools and storytelling. "This is how you grow string beans," he'd say, but more importantly, this is how you grow patience. Photos went viral. Aerial shots showed rows of crops surrounded by glass towers, like an ancient truth in the middle of a futuristic lie. One caption read, "He could have bought the world. Instead, he chose to feed it." And for the first time in decades, conversations about land, food, and worth started changing, not in boardrooms, but in backyards. The city eventually had to acknowledge what was happening. What began as one man's resistance had grown into a movement. Urban gardens started popping up across the county. Schools invited Mangonio to speak. Colleges asked him to guest lecture on sustainability. Documentaries were proposed. He politely declined most of them. "I already have work to do," he'd say. And he meant it. His day still began at 5 a.m. with watering and weeding. He still ate lunch under a mango tree he planted himself. But the world around him had changed. What was once mocked was now modeled. What was once seen as old-fashioned was now revolutionary. And all because one Filipino farmer believed that land wasn't just dirt, it was dignity. His story wasn't just about saying no to money. It was about saying yes to something far more powerful: purpose. It wasn't long before Mangonio's story reached national headlines. Major news outlets across the country ran features on the Filipino farmer who refused $50 million. Talk show hosts praised him for his integrity. Environmental activists called him a living monument. But perhaps the most unexpected recognition came from the National Farmers Union, who invited him to their annual summit in Washington, D.C. At first, Mangonio declined. He didn't like flying. He'd never worn a suit. But a handwritten letter from a young farmer in Kansas changed his mind. "You reminded me why I chose to farm," the letter read. "Because it's not about profit, it's about people." Moved by the words, Mangonio agreed to go. He arrived in a plain barong Tagalog, standing humbly among executives in tailored suits. When he took the stage, he didn't read from notes. He simply told the story of his land, his people, and his belief that feeding others is the highest form of service. His speech lasted only 7 minutes, but when it ended, the room gave him a standing ovation that lasted longer. People wiped tears from their eyes. One senator approached him backstage and said, "You've said more in 7 minutes than we've managed in 7 years." The clip was uploaded online that evening. By the next morning, it had over 10 million views. Comments flooded in from all over the world: India, Brazil, South Africa, Norway. Farmers from different continents called him Lolo Tonio, a sign of affection and respect. They said he made them proud to work the land again. Teachers played his video in classrooms. Nonprofits began using his model for urban community gardens. And through it all, Mangonio stayed grounded. When he returned to California, he went straight back to the soil. "Fame is like fertilizer," he joked. "Too much of it, and your roots burn. But just enough, it helps you grow." The developers didn't give up. Despite public admiration for Mangonio, they remained determined to purchase the land. They changed strategies, trying to appeal to his legacy. They said he could sell the land, let them build, and use the money to start agricultural foundations, scholarships, or even fund a university in his name. You could help more people with the money, they argued. But Mangonio wasn't fooled. "If helping people means destroying the one thing that already helps them," he said, "then it's not help. It's ego." He had no desire to be immortalized in stone or speeches. His legacy was already growing, literally, in every vegetable bed, every child he taught, every neighbor who left his gate with a basket full of fresh food. He didn't want to be remembered. He wanted people to remember the land, and that made him untouchable. 1 year after rejecting the $50 million offer, a new chapter began. Local school districts approached Mangonio with a proposal not to buy the land, but to learn from it. They asked if they could send students for field trips, integrate hands-on farming into science classes, and even let high schoolers volunteer for credit. He agreed immediately. Every Friday, buses would pull up to the edge of the farm. Dozens of curious kids would spill out, wide-eyed and wrinkling their noses at compost. Mangonio would greet them with a crooked smile, saying, "You want to grow strong? Grow food." He taught them how to listen to the land, the language of leaves, the rhythm of seasons, the patience of roots. Some kids were from wealthy families who had never touched soil before. Others were from struggling homes and found comfort in watching things grow. But all of them left with dirt on their hands and something deeper in their hearts. Social media turned Mangonio into a quiet global icon. Not a celebrity, but a symbol. People began sending letters, some handwritten, some typed, from as far as Uganda and Iceland. One letter came from a Filipino nurse in Dubai who said, "I showed my employer your farm and cried. I miss home. I miss the soil." Another came from a young Ukrainian refugee living in Poland. "You remind me that roots can grow again, even after war." These weren't fan letters. They were confessions. Admissions that in the race towards success and survival, people had forgotten how to slow down, how to connect, how to grow. Mangonio responded to as many as he could, often enclosing seeds from his farm with a short note, "Plant something. Anywhere. It will remember you." Those seeds became tiny revolutions in balconies, backyards, and school gardens around the world. His land, it seemed, was spreading, not by sail, but by spirit. Not everyone was inspired. Some real estate moguls still mocked him, calling his farm an eyesore. One famous developer tweeted, "Imagine saying no to generational wealth for vegetables." It went viral, but not the way he intended. People responded with photos of their own gardens, their kids holding lettuce, their grandmothers planting herbs. They used hashtags like #GrowLikeTonio and #SoilIsSacred. A tech entrepreneur offered to build an app that taught urban farming using Mangonio's voice. A singer wrote a song called 10 Acres Strong that played on local radio stations. The farm became a pilgrimage site. Couples got engaged there. A baby was even named after him, Antonio Calayan, which means freedom in Tagalog. Through all this, Mangonio remained amused. "I'm just growing vegetables," he'd laugh. But everyone else knew it was more than that. In a world obsessed with growth at any cost, he showed that not all growth is progress, and not all success is profit. One afternoon, as he was teaching a group of children how to plant eggplant, a small boy asked, "Did you always want to be a farmer?" Mangonio paused, looked out over the rows of green, and said, "No. I wanted to be someone who didn't forget where he came from." The boy didn't fully understand, but he smiled anyway and dug deeper into the soil. That moment stuck with Mangonio. That night, he opened an old box of letters from his father in the Philippines. One letter read, "You are far from us now, Anak, but if you grow food, you will always be home." Tears welled up in his eyes. He hadn't read those letters in years. But in that quiet night, he realized his father's words had taken root in him long ago. That farm wasn't just land. It was the bridge between his past and his future, between what he left and what he created. 2 years after the original offer, Mangonio was nominated for a national award, the American Spirit Medal, given to individuals who preserve culture, integrity, and community in the face of pressure. The ceremony was to be held in Washington, D.C., and the president himself would be in attendance. Mangonio wore the same barong he wore before. On the stage, under the lights, he looked out at the audience, not of investors or politicians, but of students, teachers, and everyday workers. When he received the medal, he said only one thing: "The land is not just soil, it's soul." And he stepped down, his words echoing through the auditorium like thunder in a storm. The speech was replayed on every major channel that evening. In a nation divided by politics and economy, it reminded everyone that values, once planted, grow stronger than any policy. By the third year, the developers had stopped asking. They had built every inch they could around the farm, but its green stood out brighter than ever. Property agents even began using it as a selling point: quiet homes with views of a historic urban farm. What was once a problem plot had become a landmark. Tourists marked it on their maps. School curriculums referenced it in environmental science. And Mangonio? He kept farming. His back ached more now. His hands were slower. But every morning before the city woke up, he stood with his feet in the soil and whispered a prayer in Tagalog. Salamat sa lupa. Salamat sa buhay. Thank you for the land. Thank you for life. Because to him, farming wasn't resistance. It was gratitude in action. Then came the documentary. A small independent film crew had been quietly filming for over a year. No scripts, no dramatics, just raw moments. When The Last Land Warrior premiered at a film festival in New York, it received a 10-minute standing ovation. Critics called it a modern folk story and a love letter to quiet strength. Streaming services fought over rights. The film was released globally and reached millions. In one scene, Mangonio is shown giving away his last basket of produce for the day. A woman offers to pay double. He smiles and says, "It's already paid for by the sun, the soil, and a little sweat." That line became a quote printed on t-shirts, mugs, and murals. But to Mangonio, it wasn't a slogan. It was just truth. And in a world desperate for something real, that truth hit harder than money ever could. In the months after the documentary's release, messages poured in from corners of the world Mangonio had never imagined. Letters came from children in Kenya who had started vegetable gardens in schoolyards. Emails arrived from refugees in Germany, saying his story gave them comfort during difficult nights. A group of students in Brazil began a movement called Roots Before Riches, inspired by the phrase they heard Mangonio speak in the film, "If land feeds us, it owns us in return." It wasn't just farmers who reached out. Architects began asking about sustainable soil practices. Dietitians requested permission to use his quotes in nutrition campaigns. Environmental activists asked him to be a symbol for regenerative agriculture. For the first time, Mangonio understood that his farm, once ignored by everyone but neighbors and passing trucks, had become a place of meaning. People didn't come for tomatoes and lettuce anymore. They came for hope. They came to see that in a world chasing profit, someone still believed in purpose first. And that belief spread. The farm wasn't just a patch of green anymore. It was proof that one voice grounded in conviction could resonate across the globe. In every message, in every tearful thank you, Mangonio saw a reminder. Land and life are woven together, and when humans honor that bond, something larger than money takes root. One surprising visitor came from Manila. A woman named Aling Rosa, in her early 70s, arrived at the farm with a small suitcase and a wide smile. She had heard about Mangonio on television, then saw the documentary, and felt something deep in her heart. She told him she grew up in the rice paddies near her hometown, where her family prayed for rain and thanked the earth for bounty. She said she felt Mangonio's story was Filipino soil speaking in an American landscape. They sat under the shade of a mango tree and swapped stories of seasons, harvests, and the simplicity of early mornings. Rosa told him how Filipino farmers once defended their rice fields from corporate buyouts, how they planted resilience as much as seeds, and how each harvest was a reminder of who they were. Mangonio listened with reverence, as though hearing the land itself speak through Rosa's memories. In that conversation, a bridge formed, not between countries, but between shared experience. Here were two elders who knew soil beneath their fingernails, who had seen change sweep across valleys and coastlines, who believed in the dignity of labor untouched by greed. And when Rosa left weeks later, she planted a tree at the far edge of the farm and whispered to it in Tagalog, "May you always grow wild and free." Mangonio watched her go, the soil between his toes, and understood something more profound. Some roots run deeper than borders. But not everyone was comfortable with the farm's growing influence. A tech billionaire named Marcus Vail, who owned a string of luxury properties and a seat on several city planning boards, visited Mangonio one morning unannounced. He arrived in a sleek car and spoke in a tone that tried to mix charm with authority. He didn't talk about lawsuits or offers this time. He talked about efficiency, urban planning, and progress, praising Mangonio for his commitment but dismissing it as romantic idealism that doesn't scale. He asked rhetorically why anyone would choose to farm when they could change the world by building affordable housing, schools, and hospitals. Mangonio listened, calm and unshaken, while rows of corn swayed quietly behind him. Then he said what he always said, "This land feeds people. Its value is not measured in steel beams and numbers. It is measured in bellies filled, hands healed of fear, and hope that grows as easily as lettuce." There was no anger in his voice, only conviction. Vail smirked and walked away, but the silence he left behind was telling. Not all progress is forward. Not all change is good. And not all wealth is worth having. Mangonio's response didn't just reject the man's words. It reframed the entire conversation. In the heart of autumn, the Community Farm Harvest Festival became an annual tradition. Local families gathered with baskets and blankets, children raced through pumpkin patches, and stories were exchanged over steaming plates of vegetable stew. It wasn't just a festival. It was a celebration of continuity, of seasons that never stopped despite skyscrapers rising around them. Musicians played folk songs from different cultures. A choir of teenagers sang a song about soil and stars. A poet recited verses that echoed the rhythm of rain falling on onion fields. Mangonio moved slowly through the crowd, accepting hugs, questions, tears, and laughter with the humility of a man who had never sought fame. And as tractors with children riding in trailers slowly circled the field, someone began a chant, Lupang Mahalaga. Others joined in, not as an abstract slogan, but as a lived affirmation. This land matters. A journalist wrote that the festival was like watching history bend toward collective beauty rather than lonely ambition. And at the center of it, Mangonio wasn't a spectacle, he was an anchor. The farm had become more than acreage. It was a symbol of shared roots that bound hungry hearts, eager minds, and hopeful souls to the enduring rhythm of growth, care, and community. The next winter, an unprecedented frost damaged crops all around the region, except on Mangonio's farm. While neighbor fields turned brown and brittle, his rows of kale and collard stood vibrant and alive. Meteorologists and agricultural scientists came to study why this patch of soil remained fertile when others faltered. Some pointed to his unique crop rotation, others to the biodiversity of companion planting. But villagers whispered something deeper. The land listens to the patience of the farmer. The media buzzed with headlines, the farm that defied winter. People speculated, analyzed, and debated, but Mangonio never took credit. He said simply, the soil remembers. We just have to honor it. Scientists recorded data. School children asked questions. Bloggers posted photos of green against gray snow. And in every corner of the internet, people began talking not only about the farm's resilience, but about resilience in life. The frost became a metaphor, a story shared in homes and classrooms, that even when the world seems to freeze around you, purpose, like soil tended with care, can endure. And for those watching, it wasn't just about crops surviving frost. It was about human hearts surviving hardship. A small nonprofit from Atlanta reached out with an offer. Would Mangonio be willing to help launch community farms in underserved urban neighborhoods across the United States? They sent him videos of concrete blocks, empty lots, and grassless fields where families struggled to find fresh produce. He watched in silence, thoughtful, eyes moist with urgency rather than surprise. Then he said yes, but only if they let the community lead. He refused to be a figurehead. He wanted action rooted in local voice. So volunteers and community leaders from various cities traveled to Lupang Mahalaga to learn from him directly. They came not as students of agriculture alone, but as students of relationship to land, to community, to one another. They learned to talk with the earth, not at it. They learned that soil doesn't require domination but dialogue. When they returned home, they carried seeds, tools, and lifelong lessons that went far beyond planting. They carried conviction. Concrete lots became tiny forests of basil, tomato, pepper, and lettuce. Neighborhoods once known for scarcity began to buzz with growth. Something surprising happened in those cities. As gardens grew, people grew with them. News of the Community Farm Network, inspired by Mangonio, reached a group of architects in Japan. They proposed an exchange program where designers and farmers could collaborate on agricultural living spaces, environments where homes and farms weren't separate but intertwined. Plans included rooftop gardens, sunlit courtyards full of edible plants, and water systems that nourished both the people and the produce. The Japanese team visited California. They spent days with Mangonio, asking about wind patterns and soil composition, but what they took home wasn't merely technical knowledge. It was a philosophy of shared sustenance. Home isn't just where you live, one architect said, it's where you grow. Back in Tokyo, their designs won awards not for aesthetics alone, but for human resonance. And in every blueprint they shared, Lupang Mahalaga's influence was subtle but unmistakable. Integrate life with compassion, plant not for profit but for people, honor soil not as commodity but as commons. Architects, once trained to carve skylines, began to think like gardeners, where humans and nature coexist in mutual respect. And in that shift, they realized something profound, that structures aren't just built with steel and glass, but with sacred intention. An international school in Berlin invited Mangonio to be part of a leadership series for young adults. The curriculum focused on values that shape society, and students from over 40 countries watched his interview online. One student from South Africa wrote afterward, "He taught us that courage grows in small places like soil, not in large offices." Another from Mexico said, "He reminded me that dignity isn't about wealth, it's about contribution." The conversation triggered essays, art projects, and community initiatives across continents. Children drew murals of green farms surrounded by urban life. Debate teams used his story as proof that conviction can outweigh pressure. University clubs began planting campuses with community plots for students and faculty alike. These gardens fostered cooperation between degree programs, business students teaching budgeting, biology majors explaining botany, psychology classes studying the well-being effects of gardening. The farm blossomed not just in California, but in thousands of communities stitched together by one idea. Growth is possible when rooted in purpose, not profit. The ripple effect wasn't accidental. It was intentional trust, seeded by a Filipino farmer who believed that land feeds more than bodies. It feeds souls. In a remote village in the Philippines, news of Mangonio sparked renewed interest in traditional farming methods once forgotten by younger generations. Elders began teaching children how to plant rice without chemicals, how to recognize when soil is stressed, how seasons speak through wind and light. Young people started returning to fields they had left for cities, armed with not only tools but curiosity. They filmed tutorials, blending ancestral techniques with modern understanding, and shared them online. Suddenly, interest in regenerative farming exploded, not as a trend, but as a movement of cultural reconnection. Scholars of indigenous agriculture started collaborating with tech experts to create platforms where farmers exchanged knowledge globally. Scientists from Australia researched traditional Filipino planting rhythms. Agronomists from Canada asked about soil bacteria diversity. And through it all, the underlying message was clear: knowledge that honors history, rhythm, and care rewires the world for resilience. In every corner of the globe where land was honored instead of conquered, communities found that the rhythms of growth, once drowned by industrialization, were echoes of a truth too strong to be ignored. A controversy emerged when a powerful agricultural conglomerate tried to discredit Mangonio's methods. They published reports suggesting that only industrial farming could feed the world's growing population. They said small farms were nostalgia, not necessity. They even offered to buy portions of Lupang Mahalaga with shimmering promises of funding innovations for the greater good. But the community that had formed around the farm wasn't fooled anymore. Volunteers, students, teachers, urban gardeners, scientists, and families stood with Mangonio. They organized an international forum where specialists from multiple disciplines, ecology, nutrition, sociology, and economics, presented evidence that diverse, community-centered farming is vital not only for food security but for psychological and environmental health. People spoke about healthier soil, richer biodiversity, lower carbon emissions, and stronger social bonds. The conglomerate's argument began to collapse under collective testimony. What was once seen as a groundbreaking personal choice was now recognized as a model for global sustainability. The world wasn't being asked to reject progress. It was being asked to redefine it. And the questions changed from how much can this land produce to how much dignity can it cultivate. By the fourth year of Mangonio's unprecedented stand, an unexpected shift began to take place in local policy. Town councils from neighboring cities saw the transformation happening around Lupang Mahalaga and began to rethink zoning laws that had once favored endless development over community space. Activists, inspired by Mangonio's refusal to sell, petitioned for ordinances that would protect food-producing soil from being swallowed by concrete. Farmers, gardeners, environmentalists, and students marched in support of the initiative. What started as one man's personal conviction grew into a movement demanding that productive land be valued at its worth to people, not just its worth in profit. Developers scrambled to craft new business models that married green space with innovation, but it was clear that the conversation had changed forever. Rustling leaves, once dismissed as weeds, now represented a voice in the global dialogue about land stewardship. And when the city finally passed the Soil Preservation Act, ensuring that farmland couldn't be arbitrarily zoned for luxury projects without community consent, celebrations weren't just local. They echoed across the state. People hugged, Children danced among corn stalks. Older farmers cried openly. In that moment, the invisible became visible, public policy shaped by care, not capital. And Lupang Mahalaga stood at the heart of it, like a truth rooted deep, unshakable by bulldozers or boards of directors. As Lupang Mahalaga gained legal protection, a new wave of visitors came from Asia, Africa, Europe, and South America. Not tourists, but delegations. Delegates from India came to fight corporate land grabs in their own regions. A group from Brazil wanted to learn how to revive rainforest edge farming without harming biodiversity. A cohort from Kenya came to study how small farms could alleviate hunger in urban fringes. In every group, individuals stood in the soil with reverence, as if greeting something they had lost in their own histories. They carried notebooks, cameras, and questions, but what they were really gathering were models of hope. Mangonio greeted each group with patience and humility, showing them the same rows of produce he had planted years ago with calloused hands. "This land doesn't belong to me," he would say. "It belongs to every hand that ever planted, every mouth that needs to be fed, every child who must learn." And behind him, the farm spread out, kale, lettuce, tomatoes, okra, a living testament to what is possible when people choose purpose over payout. Delegates returned home carrying stories of soil, not stock prices, rhythms, not revenue streams. And in each story shared in distant villages and cities, there was an echo of one Filipino farmer who stood firm when the world told him to sell. At the edge of the farm stood a long, simple fence that children had painted with bright colors and messages like "Grow together" and "Soil is sacred." One morning, a group of researchers visited and asked if they could analyze the painted wood, not for composition, but for meaning. What they found was not graffiti. It was collective expression. Those messages reflected a belief that land is not merely ground to walk on, but a partner in community. Interviews with families revealed that children who once spent weekends indoors glued to screens now begged to go to Lupang Mahalaga. They talked about the smell of earth, the taste of fresh celery, the sound of wind through leaves, and how it made them feel real in a world that often feels virtual. Teachers reported that kids who struggled academically began thriving when asked to plant, nurture, and harvest. Behavior reports improved. Attention spans lengthened. Emotional awareness blossomed. The farm wasn't just producing food. It was producing confidence, patience, and emotional resilience. And in those painted phrases on the fence, researchers saw a new generation learning that courage grows not in isolation, but in community. Educational theorists began recommending farm experiences as essential rather than extracurricular. Lupang Mahalaga wasn't just changing one farmer's life. It was rewriting how humans relate to growth, learning, and each other. One particularly powerful moment came when an online challenge called #PlantForTomorrow swept across social platforms. Participants shared videos of themselves planting seeds in jars, balconies, backyards, rooftops, anywhere there was soil. Users from Seoul, Nairobi, Buenos Aires, and Cairo posted clips explaining why they were planting. For clean air. For my son's future. For our neighborhood. But the most common sentiment was, because a Filipino farmer reminded me what it means to grow. Schools held classroom sessions where students explained photosynthesis alongside values like patience and grit. A biotech firm offered to match donations to community garden startups. Artists drew murals of green fields in cities where farming was once unimaginable. A teenager in Paris said, "I planted lettuce for my grandmother in Manila, even though she's never seen it." That simple act, one shared through the chain of social media, revealed something profound. When inspiration is rooted in integrity, action spreads far beyond its origin. And just like seeds carried by wind, the idea that land belongs to life, not only to profit, began sprouting everywhere. In balconies and backyards across the globe, soil became more than dirt. It became a reminder, tangible and accessible, that growth can start anywhere with a single seed and a willing heart. Not everyone loved this shift. Critics argued it was naive to romanticize small farms in an age of mass production. Analysts questioned whether a single farm could impact larger food systems. Economists who valued GDP over community gardens wrote essays suggesting that Mangonio's influence was symbolic but not structural. But even these debates recognized that something fundamental had changed. People were talking about land in terms of human value, not just economic metrics. Scholars concluded that discourse around food, sustainability, and well-being was no longer restricted to niche circles. It had entered mainstream consciousness, thanks in part to one unlikely catalyst. Thinkers from California to Copenhagen discussed how food deserts, soil degradation, and disconnection from nature were not just agricultural problems, they were societal symptoms. They quoted lines from Mangonio's speeches. They shared stories from his farm. They debated not to dismiss him, but to understand why he mattered. His story became a touchpoint for deeper questions. What do we value? Why do we chase money? What is wealth if not a healthy, thriving community? And as these questions reverberated in academic journals, dinner table conversations, and urban planning meetings, it became clear that what he stood for wasn't antiquated. It was timeless. In the small town near his farm, a new tradition began annually: Harvest Peace Day. Families from all walks of life came together not to shop, but to share. Local musicians performed songs about rain and wind and sunshine. Children recited poems about seeds and seasons. Farmers from neighboring counties brought samples of their own produce, each one telling a story of labor and love. And at the center stood Lupang Mahalaga, no longer alone, but embraced by a community that had learned how to honor more than profit. Developers who once mocked the farm attended quietly, some with visible humility, others with curiosity rather than dismissiveness. They didn't apologize. That wasn't necessary. What mattered was that they saw growth not as conquest, but as connection. Local business owners donated food for community tables. Teachers held classes outdoors on that day, so students could learn from the soil. And neighbors who once passed the farm without notice now saw a place of gathering, purpose, and celebration. Harvest Peace Day wasn't about one person anymore. It was about shared stewardship, a legacy of soil, sweat, and communal care. And every year, as the sun dipped behind rows of kale, it felt not like an end but a promise of renewal. Beyond agriculture, the ripple of influence reached technology sectors as well. A group of engineers from a sustainable tech startup visited the farm with a bold idea. Could they develop low-cost, community-friendly farming sensors and water management systems based on the lessons learned at Lupang Mahalaga? They weren't interested in automation alone, but augmentation, tools that help small farms thrive without replacing human connection. Mangonio listened intently, watching their prototypes under the sun and rain. After weeks of discussion, they agreed on a simple mission. Tech should serve the land, not control it. They developed solar-powered soil monitors, apps that connected local produce markets directly to farms, and community dashboards where neighbors could track planting schedules. These innovations weren't about replacing labor. They were about empowering communities to make land stewardship easier, more efficient, and more collaborative. And as pilot programs rolled out in underprivileged neighborhoods, people reported less waste, more yield, and deeper connection to the earth. The project became a case study in tech with compassion, showing that when innovation respects the wisdom of soil and community, the results go beyond productivity. They deepen participation. Meanwhile, in Mangonio's own life, seasons passed with their usual cadence, but each one brought new layers of meaning. He noticed how the morning dew felt colder on his bones. His hair was whiter, his steps slower, but his spirit remained firm. One morning, while tending a row of string beans, his granddaughter Amihan asked him a question. "Lolo, do you think this farm will outlive us?" He paused, thinking of seeds, seasons, roots, and rain. Then he said, "If love feeds it, yes." She smiled. Then she planted another seed. In that moment, he realized that legacy isn't only what lives after us, it's what we choose to nourish while alive. And as he watched Amihan's small hands press seeds into the rich earth, he felt a quiet certainty. This farm wasn't just a piece of land resisting developers. It was a living classroom of values, rooted in courage and sprouted through generations. And that truth, more enduring than any offer on a contract, was what he had always hoped to leave behind. University researchers reached out again. this time to study the psychology of belonging that Lupang Mahalaga had cultivated. They conducted interviews with volunteers, students, neighbors, and families who came to the farm not just for produce, but for a sense of community that had been eroded by urban alienation. Many described feeling disconnected in their own lives until they stood barefoot in soil and felt something fundamental awaken, a sense of purpose beyond self. One woman from Detroit said that after weeks volunteering on the farm, she reconnected with her own creativity and started a community art studio. A teacher from Toronto said her students who struggled with attention issues thrived when allowed to tend crops. A teenager from Mexico City said the farm gave him confidence, something school never had. Researchers wrote about eco-psychology, showing that connection to land improves resilience, empathy, and emotional health. Books were published, papers were cited, and in academic discussions, the farm became a standard reference for how environment, community, and human purpose entwined to create well-being. It was no longer just an experiment. It was evidence that humans thrive not when they dominate nature, but when they collaborate with it. Then came a moment that even surprised those closest to him. Mangonio was asked to deliver a keynote at a global sustainability summit in Geneva. Leaders from every continent convened to address climate change, food security, and community development. Organizers requested his presence not as a politician or celebrity, but as someone who lived the message. In his speech, he did what he always did. He spoke simply. Land is not something we own. It is something we inherit and return. If we forget that, we starve in ways deeper than hunger. Those words were translated into dozens of languages. And when he spoke, delegates, some of whom had spent their lives in policy and economics, listened not just with ears, but with hearts. A renowned climatologist said later that it was the most powerful message of the summit, not because it was polished, but because it was true. Television coverage framed him not as an anomaly, but as a model. Communities began to realize that sustainability isn't about grand plans alone. It's about daily choices, quiet courage, and relationships that honor life. In that hall of global decision-makers, one farmer from a tiny plot of soil reminded the world that sustainability is more than strategy. It's sacred practice. After Geneva, invitations poured in from unexpected places, grassroots movements, small towns, and international embassies. What shocked Mangonio wasn't the prestige of the invitations, but the wide-eyed sincerity behind them. A mayor from Costa Rica asked him to speak about community resilience. A cooperative in Kenya wanted his insight on land stewardship. A group of indigenous leaders from Canada invited him to collaborate on a sovereign soil initiative. Everywhere he went, his message was the same. Land is not merely property, but relationship. People told him that in a world hungry for heroes, they found something different in him. Not glory, but grounded truth. Sitting in circle meetings and communal meals, leaders discussed how to adapt the principles of Lupang Mahalaga to their own contexts. In every country, despite diverse climates, languages, and histories, they heard a similar longing for connection, purpose, and dignity. In the Philippines, his homeland, news of his global journey sparked renewed interest in community agriculture. Children in remote barangays began piloting small gardens. Elders taught traditional planting rhythms to neighborhoods once bound by economic struggle. And everywhere those seeds sprouted, people reported emotional shifts, not just greener yards, but lighter hearts. What Mangonio once thought was a small farm in California had grown into a global garden of transformation, rooted in humility and nourished by profound intention. In Tokyo, an urban architectural firm released a new model for housing developments that incorporated community farms into every rooftop and courtyard, not as decoration, but as functional spaces for growth. Inspiration came from Lupang Mahalaga's stark contrast against concrete, where steel and soil stood side by side without competition. Developers who once prioritized profit now included green architects in planning panels, seeking ways to integrate agriculture into the very foundations of cities. People began imagining entire districts where food was grown atop schools, in alleyway plots, on apartment terraces, and in public squares. Citizens rallied behind the idea not because it was trendy, but because they wanted places where hands could touch earth again, a profound craving in societies where daily life had become digitized and disembodied. And so, communities began reimagining urban spaces as living ecosystems, where nature and human habitation were collaborators rather than adversaries. In one coastal city in South Korea, residents organized workshops to teach oceanfront farming mixed with salt-resilient crops. In Switzerland, mountain villages reintroduced terraced farming to combat soil erosion, combining tradition with innovation. Everywhere the world grew, literally and metaphorically, in response to a model that asked not, how much can we extract, but how deeply can we belong? The seeds of Lupang Mahalaga had become touchpoints of a global shift in how land and life are perceived, not as resources to be consumed, but as relational gifts to be honored. Yet moments of quiet reflection were just as powerful as moments of global acclaim. On a rainy morning, Mangonio walked the perimeter of the farm alone, boots sinking into soft mud. The rain washed the produce and soaked the earth in rhythms that felt ancient and reassuring. He paused beside a young tree that volunteers had planted years earlier, its branches still small but its roots deep. He touched the bark gently, as if greeting an old friend. In his mind, he saw the faces of people he'd met, hands he'd shaken, fields he'd walked. He thought about the early years, sweating under the sun, questioning whether he had done the right thing by buying the land. And now, years later, he realized something profound. A life well lived isn't measured by money you accumulate, but by lives you touch and transform. His life had doubled back on itself, from a quiet immigrant farmer to a teacher of global possibilities. And yet, nothing about him felt foreign to the soil. In that rain, he felt rooted, not to his farm alone, but to every hand on every continent that had taken up the soil and chosen to grow. And he whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for every community that chose relationship over acquisition. The Lupang Mahalaga model began influencing global nonprofit strategies. Organizations that had once focused solely on food distribution realized something critical. Giving food fills bellies, but teaching people to grow food can fill communities. Programs expanded to include community planning sessions, intergenerational learning events, and neighborhood farms that encourage people to share seeds, soil, and stories. One nonprofit in South Africa reported dramatic improvements in community cohesion after integrating farm spaces into local planning. Families who once struggled with mistrust found common ground sowing seeds together. In Central America, a cooperative designed micro-farms in densely populated urban areas, teaching residents how to plant vertically and share produce with neighbors. And in Northern Europe, where winters once made outdoor agriculture difficult, innovators created green bubbles, solar-heated garden spaces where young plants could thrive year-round. What amazed experts was not the scale of production, but the scale of connection. People who participated in community farms reported deeper well-being, lowered stress, and a renewed sense of belonging. Psychologists began referencing these farm spaces as therapeutic environments, places that foster mental health and interpersonal connection far beyond the physical food produced. Lupang Mahalaga's influence had extended into realms that no one anticipated, not because of its size, but because of its soul. Schools that once marched students through sterile hallways now built gardens beside classrooms, integrating soil literacy into core curricula. In Quebec, an elementary teacher traced the development of Lupang Mahalaga from its humble beginnings, teaching students not only how plants grow, but why they matter, physically, emotionally, ecologically. Children wrote essays titled "If I Were a Seed" and reflections on patience, change, and interdependence. These writings often moved teachers to tears, not because of brilliance alone, but because of awakened understanding. Students learned the ebb and flow of seasons and, with it, the ebb and flow of life, growth, dormancy, renewal. They learned to fix problems without fear, to nurture rather than take, and to see within themselves the same resilience they watched in a distant farm surrounded by skyscrapers. In California, a high school environmental club used Lupang Mahalaga as a case study in sustainable development, community building, and ethical land use. They created their own mini-farms, intergenerational mentorship programs, and community harvest days, all rooted in the same philosophy that guided Mangonio's farm. Education had shifted from information to formation, shaping not just minds, but character. And as students carried seedlings home, so too did they carry seeds of compassion, patience, and wonder. Across social media, #LupangMahalaga became more than a hashtag. It became a movement identity. People posted photos of their own plots of soil, balconies, rooftops, community gardens, and the diversity was astonishing. Chilies in Chile, lettuce in Lebanon, coriander in Cairo. Some posted before and after pictures of abandoned lots, now filled with greenery and life. Others shared testimonials about how the act of sowing one seed changed their perspective on productivity, ambition, and fulfillment. Bloggers began writing not only about architecture and urban life, but about how soil and story connect humans to the world and to each other. Podcasts explored agricultural ethics alongside human dignity. Online courses on sustainable gardening soared in popularity. And in every corner of cyberspace, one narrative stood out. Growth doesn't always demand expansion. Sometimes it demands intention. People began to reassess what it means to live a rich life. Is it wealth measured in numbers? Or is it peace measured in moments, at dawn with hands in soil, under a sky that doesn't ask you to be anything other than human? LupangMahalaga became proof that tiny actions, planting a seed, feeding a neighbor, choosing dignity over dollars, can reshape the world. One remarkable shift occurred in medical communities as well. Doctors in urban hospitals began prescribing time in soil for patients suffering from anxiety, depression, and trauma. Studies emerged showing that even 5 minutes of soil contact reduces stress hormones. Nutritionists spoke about the difference between fresh food grown locally and commercial produce, not just in vitamin content, but in emotional nourishment. The concept of gardening therapy spread across clinics and community health programs. LupangMahalaga was featured in medical journals as an example of ecological healing, how physical activity, community connection, and plant life combine to restore health holistically. A nurse in Toronto shared how patients who participated in community gardening reported better sleep, stronger immune response, and a renewed sense of agency in their own lives. In Australia, psychologists used LupangMahalaga's model to treat veterans struggling with reintegration, teaching them that growth is not only in fields, but in human hearts. The farm's legacy had transcended agriculture and entered the realm of health, identity, and emotional resilience. People who once felt fragmented by modern life now found unity in soil, community, and care. And in that unity, they found healing, far deeper and more enduring than any diagnosis alone could offer. At the 10th anniversary of rejecting the $50 million offer, LupangMahalaga hosted a celebration that drew people from every walk of life: farmers, doctors, teachers, urban designers, children, parents, and elders. What had once been a modest farm festival was now a global gathering of those who believed in people-centered growth. A massive cloth banner read, "We grow so we belong." Speakers shared stories of transformation: a factory worker who started a farm instead of returning to shift work, a musician who found inspiration in soil instead of nightclubs, a grandmother who taught grandchildren how to plant sweet potatoes, and in doing so taught them strength. Mangonio stood on a simple wooden platform, older now, his voice steady but tender. He said, "If we measure life only by numbers, we miss the quiet miracles." His words were met with silence, not of shock, but of recognition. People understood that his message wasn't just about land. It was about human purpose, rooted deep, unshakable, and shared across borders. When he finished, children danced in circles of green, witnesses to a story that had grown far beyond soil, skyscrapers, or headlines. The celebration drew press from all over the world. They asked Mangonio if he ever regretted his decision. He paused, looked at families laughing among tomato vines, and said, "Regret is for those who never trust what they hold dear." Reporters scribbled those words. They became quotes in articles across continents. In Santiago, Buenos Aires, Osaka, and Lagos, news outlets replayed his message not as a cliché, but as a choice worth considering in every life. The phrase spread, "Live for meaning, not margin." It began appearing on posters in classrooms, murals in cities, and quotes shared in community centers. And from the soil to the screens, people began talking about not just what they want out of life, but why they want it. Was it accolades? Money? Or was it something deeper? Connection, care, purpose, legacy? In that collective conversation, the world began shifting its metric of success from financial gain to impact. Lupang Mahalaga, once just a farm, had become a mirror showing humans what truly matters. At the edge of the celebration, Mangonio's granddaughter, Amihan, saw her grandfather surrounded by people whose lives had changed because of his simple belief. She walked up to him and asked, "Lolo, do you think everyone can grow like you did?" He looked at her, at the soil, at the children playing, at flowers blooming even against concrete walls, and said, "Everyone grows, Anak. The question is where and why. Some choose to grow for profit, some for ego. But the ones who grow for others, they never wither." Amihan smiled, understanding more in that moment than she ever did in classrooms or books. The legacy of Lupang Mahalaga was not in buildings or millions. It was in hearts. In choices made at dawn with hands in soil. In community laughter echoing through rows of green. In the ripple of lives touched, healed, and inspired. What began as a stand against a price tag had become a movement of purpose, a testament to the enduring truth that when humans choose dignity over dollars, hope takes root. As the sun rose over Lupang Mahalaga on a crisp morning that felt unlike any before, visitors gathered quietly at the farm's edge as if they were attending a sacred ritual. Word had spread that something new was taking place, not a festival, not a political rally, not a demonstration, but a gathering of intention. People from different nations stood together, some with tears in their eyes, others with determined gazes that spoke of personal transformation. A group from Nigeria, who had toured the farm with their own agricultural delegation, stood beside families from Greece who had converted schoolyards into community gardens. A pastor from Brazil spoke softly to a gardener from Sweden about how his children learned patience through planting carrots. The gathering wasn't organized by any government, corporation, or institution. It was organized by purpose itself. As the morning ritual began, those present were handed small seed packets, diverse heirloom varieties rescued from extinction. The packets contained basil, amaranth, yams, and sunflowers. But what was most significant wasn't the seeds themselves. It was the meaning they bore, the promise of growth in places where despair once lived. The crowd dispersed slowly, each person holding their seed packet like a sacred trust, ready to plant somewhere, in city roofs, rural plots, and school courtyards around the world. And in that moment, Lupang Mahalaga was no longer a solitary patch of land. It was a movement of sowing hope one seed at a time. That afternoon, a woman from Mexico approached Mangonio with a trembling voice and eyes glistening, clutching a letter she had carried for months. She read it aloud, a testimony from her grandmother, a lifelong farmer who had lost her land to drought and economic pressure. "We survived wars, but we never thought we'd lose the soil beneath our feet," she said. "Your stand reminded us that soil is memory. Soil is prayer. Soil is home." The crowd stood silently, moved by the extremely personal story that represented countless others. There were no microphones, no cameras, just human connection unfolding in real time. For the first time since hundreds of eyes had watched him speak in Geneva, Mangonio paused not to teach, but to listen. He placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder, not with the presence of an icon, but with the humility of someone who had once stood barefoot in soil and understood loss more intimately than applause could ever convey. That moment, unplanned and unscripted, revealed the true power of Lupang Mahalaga. It was not a monument to resistance, but a living testament to empathy, where soil and story met and embraced. People walked away knowing that the farm was not an endpoint. It was a beginning, a place where grief could be acknowledged and transformed into action. That evening, under a sky muted with amber twilight, people gathered around a communal bonfire next to the farm's herb garden. Someone strummed a guitar. Someone else began singing a folk tune from their homeland. Others shared stories of personal hardship and recovery. A soldier from England who found solace in planting sunflowers, a refugee from Syria who said soil reminded her of lost orchards, a young couple from Brazil who attributed their first garden harvest to a renewed sense of belonging. There were tears, there was laughter, and most of all, there was a palpable sense of humanity knitting itself together through shared experience. Mangonio stood quietly with his granddaughter Amihan at his side, observing the gathering of voices, accents, and languages. An elder from Kenya, holding a cup of tea, said softly, "Here, we are not strangers. We are roots reaching for water from the same source." That night, the conversations didn't revolve around politics or economics. They revolved around meaning. People spoke of love regained, purpose rediscovered, and community rebuilt. In that circle of firelight and storytelling, soil wasn't soil. Crops weren't crops. They were vessels of shared hope. And as the stars flickered above, Lupang Mahalaga, precious land, resonated far beyond its acreage, into the hearts of people who had once forgotten how to grow. In the following weeks, an academic collective published a comprehensive analysis of Lupang Mahalaga's global impact, not in dollars, not in acres, but in human terms. Their report chronicled how soil-based empowerment strengthened community bonds, reduced anxiety, improved emotional resilience, and fostered cross-cultural collaboration in cities from Nairobi to New York. Schools, clinics, and urban planners incorporated lessons not simply about crops, but about commitment. The research revealed that communal farming increased trust among neighbors and deepened intergenerational relationships. Students who had previously struggled with focus and self-esteem now reported improved academic performance and social engagement, not because of conventional incentives, but because they felt connected to something larger than themselves. Authors of the study concluded that food sovereignty was not merely a policy issue, but an emotional, spiritual, and social foundation upon which resilient societies are built. They pointed out that Lupang Mahalaga demonstrated a universal truth. When people have shared purpose, they cultivate not just soil, but trust. NGOs, universities, and government agencies began to adapt their programs to prioritize community-rooted initiatives that echo the farm's principles. What was once considered the domain of agricultural development became recognized as community psychology in practice. And in that recognition, an entire field of human understanding expanded, from isolated metrics to holistic well-being. A surprising and deeply emotional moment occurred when an environmental coalition invited Mangonio to speak at the International Earth Summit. Leaders and activists from dozens of nations gathered to address climate change, sustainability, and resource equity. When it was his turn, Mangonio's voice was humble but resonant. Land isn't a commodity, it's community. The earth doesn't belong to us. We belong to the earth. The room fell silent, not in deference to celebrity, but in acknowledgement of truth. Diplomats, scientists, activists, people who had spent decades strategizing policy, found themselves moved by his simple conviction. Reporters later wrote that it was among the most impactful speeches, not because of rhetoric, but because of integrity. His words weren't about blame or accusation. They were about responsibility. And in that summit hall, representatives began to speak not only of environmental stewardship, but of cultural responsibility, the idea that preserving land is inseparable from preserving dignity. Delegates pledged to support community-centered farming initiatives across continents, integrating soil management with education, mental health, economic equity, and social justice. What began as one farmer's refusal to sell became a global commitment to care, not conquer. And in that commitment, people recognized that sustainability doesn't live in policy alone. It lives in practice in land tended with heart. Back at Lupang Mahalaga, the daily rhythm of planting, watering, and tending crops continued amidst global acclaim, honors, and initiatives. But for Mangonio, it was never about global awards or political platforms. When children ran toward him with excited shouts, when neighbors passed baskets of harvest to one another, when visitors of every background knelt in soil and smiled, that was true success. And one ordinary morning, after mist hovered gently over the fields like a promise, he sat down beside his granddaughter and asked her to plant a seed. Together they dug gently into the earth, placing the seed with reverence rather than haste. Amihan's small hands pressed it down, and she looked up at her grandfather with wonder. "Lolo," she asked, "do seeds know why they were planted?" He paused, thinking not as a man of grand speeches, But as someone who had lived in the soil long enough to hear its whisper, asterisk seeds don't need to know why they were planted, only that they are. And that moment, simple, unplanned, unforced, became the essence of the farm's legacy. That every life contributes not because it wants to be remembered, but because it chooses to nourish. Global institutions soon began incorporating lessons from Lupang Mahalaga into relief programs in regions devastated by conflict, famine, and displacement. After years of emergency food aid, agencies realized that short-term provision must be paired with long-term land connection. They launched initiatives that provided not only seeds and soil tools but community integration programs that used farming as a bridge to rebuild trust. People who had lost homes and certainty encountered soil that received them without judgment, soil that, when tended, rewarded effort with sustenance. Doctors working in refugee camps reported that families who participated in farming activities experienced higher levels of cooperation, reduced stress, and deeper emotional stability. Children played in fields rather than screens. Parents shared harvests with neighbors. Communities once fractured by conflict began to reassemble through growth. In that resurgence, people found not only food, but foundation. Lupang Mahalaga's influence had widened from agricultural resistance to human restoration. And in every corner where soil was honored and hands were willing, a kind of renewal was quietly flowering. The tide of influence even changed the language of global development. Policy papers once dominated by GDP and output now included indicators of soil health, community engagement, and emotional resilience. Report titles changed from productivity growth models to sustainable human flourishing frameworks. Analysts realized that communities anchored in shared purpose were more resilient in the face of economic crisis, climate adversity, and social fragmentation. Reporters who once interviewed CEOs for economic predictions now interviewed farmers, teachers, artists, and children who explained how soil had become a source of wisdom. Wealth, it turned out, was not a number. It was well-being. And communities oriented around care rather than consumption fared better not only in statistics, but in stories of life regained. Scholars cited Lupang Mahalaga in talks on economics, anthropology, psychology, and ethics, not as a novelty, but as a breakthrough in human understanding. And in academic halls, boardrooms, and kitchen tables alike, people began asking deeper questions. What is the value of life? How do we define success? And how do we measure flourishing beyond production? In those questions, a perspective shift was taking place, one rooted not in accumulation, but connection. On the 15th anniversary of the pivotal moment, when Mangonio first said no to $50 million, an enormous earth mural was unveiled in the town square. It was painted by artists from around the globe, each contributing imagery of soil, roots, hands, and community. Families laid flowers upon it, children danced around it, and elders wept softly as they remembered how far the story had come. Representatives from continents, cultures, and communities stood together beneath the mural that spoke of growth, dignity, and belonging. A reporter asked Mangonio how it felt to see the world interpret his simple choice in so many ways. He smiled, looking not at the mural but at the people whose lives had been altered not by dollars, but by example. He said, "This mural is beautiful, but it is nothing more than soil colored with imagination. The real masterpiece is every hand that continues to grow." That phrase, once again profound in its simplicity, was shared across continents. And in its whisper, it carried truth, that life, when chosen with purpose over profit, yields more than harvests. It yields human meaning. And so the story of Lupang Mahalaga did not end. It evolved. Not as another viral footnote, not as an isolated legend, but as a living, breathing testament to what it means to choose life over money. In a world where the pursuit of wealth often outruns the pursuit of humanity, one Filipino farmer stood firm, not because he was unbending, but because he was rooted. His farm, once a stubborn patch in the middle of Silicon Valley development, became a symbol of what matters: connection over consumption, dignity over dominance, community over capital. Those who visited did not leave the same. They carried lessons back to cities, villages, classrooms, council chambers, and family dinners. And wherever those lessons were planted, the world grew. not only in food, but in empathy, purpose, and collective heart. Because at the end of the day, soil is more than earth. It is history, memory, promise, and song. And when people honor it with care, they discover that the most precious land isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in lives nourished, connections formed, and hope sustained.